Well, one thing that led me to write this book, entitled What is Biblical Theology, was my own quest to figure out what biblical theology is. And so I was very interested in this discipline because I wanted to understand, for one thing, what people were talking about when they used the phrase biblical theology. But for another thing, I wanted to understand how the biblical authors themselves interpret the Bible. And so as I was working on this larger volume entitled God's Glory and Salvation Through Judgment, I feel like I really got my arms around what people are trying to do when they engage in this discipline of biblical theology. And then once I had completed the larger volume, I felt like I could distill the ideas down into a crisp and direct statement. So this book that's been translated actually has no footnotes. And so it's not an academic work so much as it is an introductory work. And it's intended to help people understand, as I argue, that biblical theology is an attempt to understand and embrace the interpretive perspective of the biblical authors. And then I try to trace out what goes into an interpretive perspective or a worldview. And I argue that there are these big concepts that go into your worldview, like the overarching master story in which you understand yourself and the world, and then the truths that you derive from that story, the behaviors that either correspond to or contradict that story, the culture of the group of people that agree on what is normal in response to that story, the way that we should respond to the author of the story, God, in praise and thanks, and also the things that we should value. And then there are things like patterns that unfold within the story. So all of these concepts and symbols that summarize and interpret the story, these kinds of things, they all inform this concept of worldview or interpretive perspective. And what I'm trying to do is understand how the biblical authors looked at the world and then join them in looking at world and life and earlier scripture the same way that they did.